The following podcast contains clips from the stage play The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, recorded between 1988 and 1989. The audio in these clips has been taken from the best sources available, but due to the age of the recordings and lack of any official or professional capturing of the sound, the quality of these segments is less than optimal. But, as they are the only known recordings of this important work of theater, they are included here as a record of the production. As our evening at the theater begins, we are met by the sounds of a well-played violin. And as the curtain is drawn back, we find ourselves face to face with the visage of Sherlock Holmes, bowing his signature instrument amidst the adornments of Baker Street. As the spotlight on Holmes fades, we see another familiar face emerge from the darkness and are greeted by the welcoming voice of Dr. John Watson.
The circumstances which led to my first meeting with Sherlock Holmes, a meeting which was to change and shape my life, are of no consequence, except to say that I had been serving as an army doctor in the Second Afghan War. I was wounded and dispatched home in frail health. For 9 months, I stayed in a private hotel in the Strand, leading a comfortless, meaningless existence and spending as much money as I had, considerably more freely than I ought. So alarming did the state of my finances become that I soon realized that I must either leave the metropolis and rusticate somewhere in the country, or make a complete alteration to my style of living. I was without kith or kin to concern me, and therefore I was, I suppose, as free as air.
Well, as free as an army pension of 11 shillings and sixpence a day will permit a man to be.
Oh,
Watson, tell the truth. Not as much of it as your gullible public can digest.
Opening night of The Secret of Sherlock Holmes was at the Yvonne Arnaud Theater in Guildford on August 30th, 1988. But the play went through many trials and tribulations before that successful debut, and it all began as an idea inside the mind of Jeremy Brett. By 1987, Jeremy, who had long struggled to portray the inner thoughts and feelings of this fictional genius, had begun recording a series of audio journals in which he laid out a number of embellishments for the character beyond the details found in the writings of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Across 8 hours of tape, Jeremy had created a complex backstory for Holmes, detailing his relationship with his mother and father, his adventures as a child, and his inner feelings about everything from Irene Adler to Moriarty, with particular focus on his deep friendship with Dr. Watson. Armed with this character study and longing to return to the theater, Brett commissioned his good friend, writer Jeremy Paul, to take his tapes and create an original work for the stage. Paul, who had written numerous episodes of the Granada series and had even won an Edgar Allan Poe Award for his work on the Musgrave Ritual, was excited to oblige, and the two men immediately got to work crafting a script. In his introduction to the published playbook, Jeremy Paul recalled, "Jeremy reminded me that it was Holmes' centenary and we ought to do something about it. A celebratory evening in a theater, extracts from the canon, a reading, a birthday present anyway. The challenge triggered off something that must have been burrowing away in my subconscious. While doing the adaptations for Granada, I found myself more and more fascinated by the beginnings of the stories, wherein lay this extraordinary, detailed Victorian friendship between two men. Just friendship, uncomplicated in its nature. Something that perhaps our hurrying world has lost sight of. Added to this was Conan Doyle's sharp insight into the social and moral climate of his times. So often, the openings of the stories had to be skimmed in the television versions in order to move quickly into the narrative of the case. As I began examining those overlooked moments, it was like stumbling across a trunk full of treasures in an attic. Eventually, I told Jeremy that I wanted to write the play based almost entirely on Conan Doyle's own words. Entranced, but perhaps a little wary, Jeremy commissioned it, and I plunged headlong down what I knew was a thorny and well-trodden path. I didn't care. I plundered the canon for bits from this story and that, discovering along the way Conan Doyle's marvelous ear for theatrical language and humor. Between Brett's enthusiasm, Conan Doyle's prose, and Paul's talent as a scriptwriter, something very special exploded onto the London theater scene in the summer of 1988.
You have been in Afghanistan, I see.
Yes. How the deuce did you know that?
Well, my reasoning tells me that he was a gentleman of a medical type, but with the air of a military man, clearly an army doctor then. He has just come from the tropics, for his face is dark, but that is not the natural tint of his skin, but his wrists are fair. He has seen hardship and sickness, and his left shoulder has been wounded. Now, where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen such hardship and got himself wounded? Clearly in Afghanistan.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Oh, that's complex. The whole thought did not occupy a second.
How do you put these powers to use?
It is my trade. I am a consulting detective.
This exchange, lifted almost verbatim from A Study in Scarlet, is followed immediately by another of Doyle's most well-known deductions, one which had also been omitted from the Granada series, that of Watson's pocket watch from The Sign of Four.
Oh.
Yeah.
Would you think me impertinent if I put your gifts to a more severe test? I have here a watch which recently came into my possession. Would you do me the kindness to give an opinion as to the character and habits of the late owner?
There's hardly any data. It has recently been cleaned.
Yes. Yes.
Subject to your correction, I would say that it belonged to your elder brother, who inherited it from your father, H.W., who has been dead these many years. Your brother was left with good prospects, but he threw away his chances. Lived for some time in poverty, with occasional short intervals of prosperity, until finally, taking to drink, he died. That is all I can gather.
That is unworthy of you, Holmes. You have made inquiries into the history of my unhappy brother. It was Stamford, wasn't it? And now you pretend to deduce this knowledge in some fanciful way. It is not kind. And to speak plainly, it has a touch of charlatanism about it.
Well, my dear doctor, I crave your forgiveness. Viewing the matter as an abstract problem, I forgot how personal and painful a thing it might be to you. However, I do assure you, I didn't even know that you had a brother until you handed me that watch. If you look at it more closely, you will see that it is cut and marked all over from the habit of keeping it next to coins and keys in the same pocket. Thus your brother was careless. The watch is worth, shall we say, 50 guineas, so he was well provided for. Now, if you look at the inner plate, you'll see that it does carry the mark of the pawnbroker. Look at the thousands of scratches around the keyhole. What silverman's key could have scored those grooves? And yet you'll never find a drunkard's watch without them. He winds it at night and leaves those traces of his trembling hand. The watch is now in your possession, so the poor fellow must have died. I mean, where is the mystery in all this?
That's wonderful.
No, it's not. It's elementary.
The inclusion of these pivotal moments which for various reasons were never to make their way onto the screen via Granada, are welcome additions to the play, and serve as the closest that fans of the series would ever come to seeing Brett and Hardwick portraying those famous first encounters between the great detective and his friend. From the onset, Paul and Brett had decided that the stage play would include a bouquet of Doyle's greatest moments, all of which would emphasize the friendship between Holmes and Watson. And at the heart of the work would be the mystery of how Holmes could have deceived his only friend for 3 straight years after the incident at the Reichenbach Falls. About those early days writing the script, Jeremy Paul recalled, "I wrote the play in about 6 weeks. I was so high on the project. By contrast, it took me about 9 to 10 weeks to write Wisteria Lodge for the telly. Anyway, I rang Jeremy and said, if you can get over here by 5 o'clock, the last page of the play will be off the press. He was there by 5 o'clock. He sat and read the play instantly. He gave the most wonderful response any writer could wish for. Usually you write a play and 3 years later, 4 people have deigned to read it. In typical Jeremy fashion, he said, we start tomorrow. We rehearse." Initially, the idea was that the play would be a one-off, a very special single performance for friends and colleagues. It would be written, rehearsed, and staged between the completion of the 2-hour Sign of 4 telefilm and the commencement of work on The Devil's Foot. Jeremy Paul remembered, "We went into a kind of rehearsal situation more or less straight away. Ted Hardwick wasn't available, so we got a splendid actor named Sebastian Stride to play a youngish Watson, aged about 36. Initially, the play was a 3-hander. We actually rehearsed for 6 weeks at the Oval in the Granada rooms. I directed it. Jeremy used the techniques he had picked up from Ingmar Bergman, where the director's chair is empty, and various members of the company pass through it at certain times. I would sometimes vacate the chair, and Jeremy would take it. I would become Holmes. Sebastian would take it, and I would become Watson. Then Jeremy would become Watson. We explored the whole play from any number of different points of view. I even got roped into playing Conan Doyle, narrating from the wings, and several other small parts, including the ghost of Moriarty. I remember one wonderful morning when Robert Stevens came in and took the director's chair and watched what we were doing. He was wonderfully helpful and perceptive. It was a thrilling morning of theater." After 6 weeks of intense rehearsals, the production was ready to be shared with the world. But there was still one hurdle to cross. Jeremy Brett, who had developed a personal and deeply respectful relationship with Dame Jean Conan Doyle, daughter of Sir Arthur, felt that the play, being something of a departure from the canon, required her blessing before it could be shown to an audience, as she recalled when interviewed by John Tibbets in 1988.
I was consulted very early on in that I was asked to a private view on a Sunday. I was sent the script, and I could see nothing objectionable in it at all. I thought it was a very elegantly written little play, fascinating in its way, something that I think would have amused my father greatly. He didn't much mind what liberties were taken on the stage, within reason, providing they were in good hands, the hands being William Gillette. I don't think he would have been so happy with some other actor-producers. But certainly with The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, it's been beautifully handled by people who obviously love Holmes and Watson. And the acting is splendid. Jeremy Brett's been appearing as Holmes in films for the television for a long time now, but his performance has changed beyond measure. I didn't really like him in the early series. He was far too arrogant and too mannered, too highly strung altogether, whereas Holmes was a very cool character. And it has been wonderful to see the change in him, and that the last series, instead of being a rather unpleasant man, he became an endearing man, in spite of his conceit, in spite of this, that, and the other. He's somebody who you really care about. And I think it's an absolutely great performance.
With Dame Jean's blessing, the first iteration of the play, simply titled An Evening with Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, debuted on Sunday the 6th of September, 1987, at the Mayfair Hotel in London. Brett and Paul invited a group of very close friends and colleagues for the special occasion, which was billed as a centenary celebration of Doyle's most famous creation. The night was a resounding success, and on the spot, impresario and theater producer Duncan Weldon stated that he would be willing to finance the production at scale, with a few caveats. Jeremy Paul would have to be omitted from the cast moving forward, and the script would need to be whittled down to a two-hander. Jeremy Paul was more than happy to acquiesce, and they all walked away from the evening with a feeling of triumph. However, it would take time before the play would return in its next incarnation, as David Stewart Davies explained in Bending the Willow. After the euphoria of the evening, there was a lull. The Granada series went back into production with The Devil's Foot, and the idea of the play seemed to drift away. Jeremy Brett also began to ponder whether he really wanted to tie himself to the rigorous and demanding shackles of a West End play 6 nights a week and 2 matinees. During this lull, Jeremy Paul had rearranged the play to eliminate the narrator. There were now to be just Holmes and Watson on stage. This amputation and breaking of certain textual bones sharpened the play and increased its theatrical appeal. In the end, it was Paul's agent, suitably impressed by the slimmed-down version of the play, who pushed for its production. She contacted director Patrick Garland, who responded enthusiastically, and suddenly things began to take off. The agent of whom Davies speaks was Jane Anakin, and, as Michael Cox wrote in his book, apart from her crucial contribution to the secret of Sherlock Holmes, Jane Anakin was an enthusiastic supporter of the television series, delighted that it brought Jeremy Brett back to work in this country. It also pleased her that Jeremy Paul was the most frequent scriptwriter on the team. She introduced me to John Madden, a very gifted director, and took me on as a client when Granada decided that I was redundant. To all these people and many others, she acted as a friend and counselor, as well as a very astute agent. The aforementioned Patrick Garland would come to direct the final iteration of the stage play, which at this point had been retitled to A Case for Sherlock Holmes. Garland, who was an incredibly accomplished author and poet, as well as an actor and director of the stage and screen, worked closely with Paul and Brett to streamline the production and give it the added stagecraft which helped to accentuate the dramatic tension of the script, while also embracing the softer moments between Holmes and Watson. One of Garland's more controversial decisions for the play was to utilize wholly original music and not to incorporate the familiar refrains of Patrick Gower's iconic Granada themes. The reasons behind that decision remain lost to time, but the resulting original score is a lovely Victorian suite of melancholic violin pieces that perfectly accent the actions on stage and is a composition worthy of the great detective. We recently spoke with secret composer and award-winning songwriter of the stage and screen, Nigel Hess, who shared with us a number of insights about his work on the play.
Well, so how were you first approached about the Sherlock Holmes project? How'd you get involved?
I was working down at Chichester Festival Theatre, and it was the time when Patrick Garland was the artistic director down there. And he said, look, I've been approached about this idea of the Sherlock Holmes stage show. And he said, do you fancy sort of coming up with some musical ideas for it? Because I was just the composer that happened to be around there in the theatre at the time, down at Chichester. And I never quite asked the question, which I know other people asked, but I never asked it, was why they wanted original music for the stage show and didn't fall back on the wonderful music that Patrick Gowers had written for the series, because by that time they'd done 3-4 series by that time.
Yeah.
So Patrick had written a lot of music, but I guess they just wanted a fresh approach and somebody who knew, I guess, how to write for theatre specifically, which I did. So I was delighted it came back because I had a great time.
But you had met Patrick before this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I was reading music at Cambridge for 1 year, I think. He was assigned as one of my composition teachers. So I would get on the train from Cambridge and go down to Patrick's house and take him my latest scribblings, and he would sort of critique them.
Did you ever reconnect with Patrick in later years? Did you ever discuss The Secret of Sherlock Holmes with him?
Sadly, no.
Yeah.
But, I mean, by that time, Patrick was off doing so many other things that I'm sure he wasn't sitting at home fuming that he hadn't been asked to do The Secret of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he'd written more than enough Sherlock Holmes music by then to last an absolute several lifetimes. So
Yes.
maybe he was glad that somebody else sort of momentarily took it over.
Yes.
But we only had 2 musicians. We had money for 2 musicians. But it was in the days when electronic keyboards were really coming into their own. And so we were able to create a lot of sounds just with 2 musicians. And, of course, we had the inevitable violin, for all the reasons that Sherlock Holmes fans know about. So that dictated one of our musicians, and then the keyboard player did everything else. And we would, like any theatre production, we'd sit in the rehearsal room and watch Jeremy and Edward, rehearsing their scenes, and then decide, a bit like an episode of the TV production, exactly where music would go and what music would need to do.
So it was performed live every night with those 2 musicians, and it didn't ever go to a tape. It wasn't ever recorded.
That's the amazing thing, because you would have thought that somehow they would have tried to make it work, and it would be much more economical to have it all recorded and just played into the production. But I think Patrick quickly realised that he needed music to time to the dialogue on stage. He didn't want to put Jeremy and Edward into dramatic straitjackets in order that whenever we played a music cue, they would have to deliver exactly the same thing every night. So I constructed it so the music would react to the speed that they did the dialogue every night. So they were free to do it as they wanted, and the musicians would fit in with them rather than the other way around. And in fact, looking at the score, it is absolutely riddled. It's covered with vocal cues. So you wait for Jeremy to get to the end of this line, and we know that by the end of that line, the piece of music underneath him will have had to have reached this point. Now, if you have it pre-recorded, it's impossible to do that for obvious reasons.
Right.
I wanted them to know that the music, as far as they were concerned, was in safe hands, that I was supporting their performances with the music, and I wasn't going to get in the way, and that I wasn't just coming in at the end and sticking the music on like a plaster. Music was evolving from what I'd seen them do in the rehearsal room.
A suite of music from the play, performed by the London Film Orchestra, was included on Nigel's album, Screens and Stages, which can be purchased on Amazon or wherever fine music is sold. Many of the show's more personal and insightful pronouncements from Holmes came directly from the actor playing him, as writer Jeremy Paul explained. I was able to tap Jeremy's own knowledge of Holmes through a series of tapes he made, gleaned from 5 years of playing the part. Brilliantly, he filled in gaps, such as the mystery of Holmes's unrecorded childhood. An actor has to resolve these things. Or his inner feelings, for instance, about the woman, Irene Adler. The tapes were to prove invaluable. To David Stewart Davies, Jeremy Brett recalled this process and the reasons behind the infamous tape recordings. He said, I crawled into every corner of my imagination to find out what made Holmes. I have this whole history of him as a child, which I used to fill this chasm, to find out what he's made of. You see, he was tied very tight as a child in the cot, as they used to do in those days to keep them quiet. Children were seen but not heard, especially in the Holmes household, which I've always placed in my mind in Cornwall. Very remote, a bleak house. Never knew his father at all until he was 21, saw him but never spoke to him. He had an elder brother who was fat and a little bit far ahead of him. They didn't have much in common either. They were kissed by their mother on her way down to dinner, but that's all. Isolation from an early age. Typical Victorian upbringing. I think he had more in common with his mother. She was the brains. But of course, women were not allowed to say much in those days, and this reserve rubbed off on Sherlock. His father was a fat ex-army toad, I think. Anyway, he escaped to Eton or one of the major public schools. He was a spidery person, with no color in his face, no friends, scared of friendship, but brilliant at certain subjects. Brilliant at fencing and boxing, but always the person who walked away from personal encounters. He was devastatingly unattractive, white as a sheet, spotty probably, with all the complications of puberty and no one there to guide him through it. Probably loved singing and joined the choir. University, I would plump for Oxford. Then brilliance, growing, mind-developing, debating societies. Probably saw a girl who he fancied, but she didn't see him. That one rejection did it. The one time he placed himself in a vulnerable situation, and to see her turn away and choose someone else, snapped the door shut like a steel trap, never to be opened again. What should he do now? Return home to his family and take up some dreary duties associated with the estate? He wanted to escape that. Mycroft, ahead of him, had escaped. He'd waddled out of university and managed to get a junior post in the current government. Sherlock, isolated as he was now, forced himself to find his own way, his own job, and therefore become himself.
Oh, the cruelty of parents to their children. My brother and I, forced by accepted convention and upbringing into such a frosted, trapped, inhibited, dark corner that we could not even communicate with each other. My father, absent, though never far away. I heard his voice, his step, but I scarcely exchanged a word with him until I was 12. Mother, poor creature, starved of affection. Yet I never heard her cry. Not once. A boy is shut away in the care of a nurse. That vicious nurse! And that house. Oh, the terror of silence!
It's fascinating to see how bits of Jeremy, from his love of music and his observations about his father, the military man, integrated themselves into his tapestry of Holmes' background, and sheds light on many of the subliminal character choices that Mr. Brett made over the 10 years he portrayed the great detective. Author Jeremy Paul's daughter, Sophie, recently spoke to us about her father's process with Jeremy's tapes and shared a number of thoughts and recollections from his archive.
That's how I remember it, that Jeremy came to Dad and said, I want you to do it, darling, you're the one. that was the kind of sentiment behind it as I remember it. You mentioned that you'd heard tale of these tapes, the famous tapes
yes.
that Jeremy Brett had recorded, which sadly I haven't laid my hands on, but I have found another notebook which does, I think, refer to the tapes and summarize the kind of main points that Jeremy made on the tapes. And what's quite interesting, I think, is from the writer's point of view, is that if you have someone with as strong a personality as Jeremy Brett, and he says, this is what I want to do, and these tapes, which were obviously very, he had a lot of ideas about how he wanted it to be. And I think it's quite a delicate balance to absorb all of that and try and be true to what the originator is after. But there also obviously comes a point where you have to sort of fly on your own with a script and try and build it into, follow your own instincts about where it should go and what it should be. And I imagine for Dad, with Jeremy being such a dominant personality, that must have been, he was a very non-confrontational dad, and he was a great sort of people person. And so I think that, maybe that's why Jeremy wanted him to do it, because he knew that they wouldn't come to blows over it. But he...
Right.
Oh, yeah, here we go. So he's written all these notes off the back of tapes, and then he comes to a new clean page and he writes a title, A Broad Idea of It. And then he's written, simply need to absorb and have available Doyle tapes, but now must start to depart into imagination. So obviously, I think when they started it, they called it An Evening with Sherlock Holmes, and they did a little sort of taster of it.
Yeah.
And I found this page, another page in this notebook with Dad's opening speech. Dad obviously stood up at the start and gave a speech. And there was a nice little paragraph I found. So he says, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this centenary celebration of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. My name is Jeremy Paul, and I have to confess at once that I am one of the many loafers and idlers who have meddled down the years with this great man's work, for profit and for pleasure. I thought that was a nice way of summing up his relationship.
When the play officially opened in Guildford in 1988, the same week that Granada's Hound of the Baskervilles premiered on ITV, Edward Hardwicke had been restored as Watson, but the title of the play, The Case for Sherlock Holmes, and the billing line, TV stars in a new stage thriller, were leading audiences to expectations that the play was not fulfilling. According to David Stewart Davies, audiences had been expecting a straightforward Holmes mystery, a client with a problem, an old house, strange behavior from servants, a luminous animal perhaps, some danger, and a deductive denouement. The qualifier, a case, seemed to underline these expectations, so it was soon dropped, and the final title, The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, was implemented. But it wasn't just the audiences who missed the mystery, as it were. Jeremy Paul admitted that Duncan Weldon, the producer, was always worried that it didn't have a case. You see, he had billed it as a mystery and a thriller, but that was just Duncan trying to get an audience. I told him that you cannot put another second of burden on those two actors at that pitch by also including a standard Holmes mystery. You have to take the play for what it is. And dear Jeremy agreed. And so, rechristened as The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, the play was ready to stand on its own feet and face audiences and critics alike with its bold approach and a certain new spin on one of Holmes' greatest cases. In the course of our researches into The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, we were lucky enough to speak with a number of people who worked on the play back in its heyday. Longtime member of the crew, Alyssa Swinglehurst, who served as assistant stage manager of the show from early on, had many fond memories of her time with the production, which she shared with us in a recent interview.
I mean, it was an incredibly friendly company. It was a very happy company. And as I say, that always comes from the number one dressing room. You know, he set a really, really lovely atmosphere. I think my favourite cue, actually, was the top of the show. If anyone can remember this, the top of the show used to start with Jeremy at the top of some library steps playing the violin in the middle of the stage. But because climbing up library steps is quite a precarious business, he couldn't climb up the library steps with the violin because you need both your hands to steady yourself to go up the steps. So my job was to hand him the violin. And I used to love that cue because we always just had a funny little exchange at the top of the show as I handed him the violin. You know, that was always a sort of just a sweet moment. And I remember one night watching him, the scene where he used to go up through the middle of the stage and do taking the cocaine scene. And there would be a light come down from a spotlight or something from quite high up, so it gave him a sort of dramatic effect. And one night he's doing this and he started to extemporise, as he often did at this bit. He was just extemporising. He's going on about the darkness and the lights and saying, "Where's my light? Where's my light?" And I'm sitting there watching him, literally, I'm right in his eye line, thinking, God, that's just so metaphorical, metaphysical, what he's talking about here. And then I realised that, in fact, what he was telling me was that the spotlight hadn't come on. and the lighting cue had gone wrong, so I was like, oh, okay. So I nudged the DSM and say, no light. He was fully aware on stage of everything that was going on, and and he would say, he'd come off stage and say, "There's somebody 5 rows back on, give them the seat number and say they're taking a photograph." Okay. So how does he do all this? It's incredible. Jeremy also took to doing some extemporising after the show. So he'd finish, and then during the curtain call, he'd feel the need to talk about something or another, whatever was going on in the world. He was very excited when the Berlin Wall came down. A few nights he would talk about that and how wonderful that was. Jeremy was very special, and he had a profound effect on my life, and still does. He's still one of the most important people in my life ever. A remarkable man. But he and I became very good friends, and the first night we went out for dinner together, we used to go to a restaurant called Chez Solange, which was just sort of along from the stage door. It was very handy, and he would habitually have a steak and chips. drink red wine and eat steak and chips. He was a person of habit. He would only, you'll know, I think, from Prim saying that he only ever wore this blue cashmere quarter button jumper, white trousers, red socks. And he liked to go to Chez Solange and have steak and chips after the show to kind of wind down, you know. And remember once we were going out, there was some pub that Albert Finney had recommended. And so we all decided we're going to go and explore this pub. It's great food. And Ted was driving and Jeremy was in the other front seat and I was in the back with Kate Elliott. And we set off to find this pub. And then we found the pub and it was shut. So they were like, OK, well, we'll have to go somewhere else. So we had a copy of the Good Pub Guide. We find there's a pub on Ilkley Moor. So we go up this road where it says to the moor, and you get up to the top of the moor, and there's just like a couple of sheep. So okay, that's no good. And so we pull over, and there's this kind of this Yorkshire, proper Yorkshireman, walking along in a gabardine mac with a collie dog on a piece of string and a flat cap. And Jeremy winds down the window and hails him. Said, "My good man, could you please tell us the way to Moor Top?" And this fella leans in the window by Jeremy and takes a good look round the car and thinks for a moment and goes, "No." Just goes on his way. Anyway, and eventually we do find this pub. But I'll never forget that encounter with that fella, you know, Jeremy being very sort of Jeremy and just getting this one syllable, "No."
The production was now in full swing, but dreaming up the play and performing it turned out to be two very different things for the lead actor, and Jeremy Brett found the relationship between Holmes and the theater audience difficult at first. Believing Holmes to be a, quote, man of isolation and a very private man, Jeremy strove in his performance to slowly reveal the inner workings of the character, not letting the audience see these aspects of Holmes from the start. To blogger Gunner54, Jeremy confided, "I try not to look at them, the audience, for the first 15 minutes. I don't even look at Watson very much either. I kind of gradually open up to them. That was the hard part of moving into the theater. But my director, Patrick Garland, helped me with that. He said, 'Put a pane of glass down between you and the audience and don't look at them. Ignore them. And then, after about 15 minutes, warm through and let them in.'" The first act of the show played much like a greatest hits collection, embracing an examination of the friendship between the good doctor and the great detective through a series of vignettes spanning the many cases over which the duo had prevailed. A number of these scenes had already appeared on the Granada series, so it's fascinating to see them transposed for the stage.
Watson, congratulate me, I'm engaged to be married.
Thank you. Congratulations. To whom?
The Milverton's housemaid, I needed information.
You've gone too far.
No, it was the most necessary step. I'm a plumber with a rising business. Escort, my name. I've walked with her and I've talked with her. Heavens, those talks.
But the girl!
God, the help wasn't God to help. One must play one's cards as best one can when such a stake is on the table. However, I do rejoice to tell you that I do have a hated rival who will cut me out the moment my back is turned. Ah, what a splendid night it is!
Especially fascinating are instances in which Edward Hardwicke is delivering lines previously delivered by David Burke.
Watson, my ancestors were country squires and seem to have lived a life that is natural to their class. Now, my faculties for observation and deduction may have come from my grandmother, who was a sister of Verbatim, the French artist.
Verbatim?
Art in the blood is liable to take the strangest form.
How do you know that it's hereditary?
Because my brother, Mycroft, possessed it in a larger degree than I do.
Your brother? I didn't know you had a brother or relations of any sort. And to acknowledge a brother who is your superior...
I cannot agree with those that rank modesty among the virtues. When I say that my brother Mycroft has better powers of observation than I, you may take it that I am speaking the exact and literal truth.
Does he use these powers for detective work?
When the art of detection began and ended in reasoning from an armchair, my brother would be the greatest criminal agent that ever lived. But he has no ambition, no energy.
What is his profession then?
He works for the British government.
Another inclusion of note is the famous sequence from the Naval Treaty in which Holmes discusses the youth of England. a sequence that Jeremy Brett fought unsuccessfully to have included in the Granada episode, but which he was able to include here.
Oh, see, Watson, see. Those ragged little street urchins. The scarecrows. I mean, look at their naked feet. And their eager, expectant faces. It's monstrous. Monstrous. Ah, what a cheery thing it is to leave London by any of these lines which run high and allow you to look down upon the houses.
What's there, Clapham?
Those isolated clumps, the board school, the lighthouses, my boy, beacons of the future, capsules with hundreds of little bright seeds in each, out of which will spring a wiser, better England of the future.
And there were other featured moments sure to delight fans of Jeremy Brett. One showcased the actor breaking into a soaring vocalization of Wagner in the middle of a revelation about Watson's marriage to Mary Morstan.
Oh, Wagner, Wagner! If music be the food. Mary Morstan is delightful. Very good for Watson, no doubt.
The first act of the play concluded with the infamous Reichenbach fall sequence set to the sounds of rushing water and an overlay of thick fog across the stage.
What happened on that fateful trip is well recorded, and it is not a subject upon which I would willingly dwell. But should there be anyone here ignorant of that appalling event, let me simply say that near the Swiss village of Meiringen, at the falls of Reichenbach, where the torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss, Holmes finally confronted his arch enemy, Moriarty.
By all accounts, the Reichenbach sequence was a visually stunning highlight of the evening, but the effect could be problematic, as we learned in recent conversations with both Deputy Stage Manager Sally Tynan and Assistant Stage Manager Alyssa Swinglehurst.
The Reichenbach Falls was this cascade of dry ice, never been done before. It was beautiful. It looked like water cascading out of the sky, out of the gods. Bloody nightmare, really. But it was this huge tank which had to be checked and filled up, but it had to sit up on the flies. The dry ice machines in those days didn't start immediately, so I had dry ice cues that were a few seconds before we actually saw the ice. So I had to work out where to give the cue in order for it to be present. It was a bit of a nightmare because the dry ice machine wasn't working very well, but actually, touch wood, most of the time, we had this beautiful cascade of dry ice which worked really well.
The Reichenbach Falls was always a moment of immense amusement because sometimes it worked and sometimes not so much. It was basically just dry ice. Well, it was dry ice and light and sound to create the illusion. And as long as the dry ice worked, it looked amazing. And it would start to kind of trickle out of the top of the fly floor where the ice machines were. And when it would drop, because of the temperature difference, it would drop down and then hit the stage and then barrel down the stage into the stalls. And it just looked incredible. And when you light it and you add in the sound of waterfall, it's a very convincing effect. But sometimes it's just the smoke didn't want to go. I might be, whatever, ambient temperatures or something. We used to spend hours cleaning out all the pipes and finding all sorts of weird stuff in there. But, yeah, it was always a kind of, is it going to happen? And if you had successive Reichenbach Falls not working, Jeremy could get a bit fretty and say, please just sort that out. Because he was pitching his performance to that effect working. And it's difficult if the smoke bit isn't working. But, yeah.
I lost a friend. One whom I regarded as the best and wisest man I've ever known.
And then, through the miracles of stagecraft, we leap 3 years ahead to Holmes' miraculous return in the guise of an elderly bookseller.
As if I was a little gruff in my manner, that I meant no harm by
You
it.
make too much of a trifle, sir. Oh, well, may I ask how you know who I am?
But I own a little bookshop on the corner of the church. I was very happy to see you at any time, I'm sure. Perhaps you collect. I have here British birds, Catullus, the Holy War.
Please, I wonder if
everyone.
Would you mind waiting outside?
Just the thing that every man needs these days, you know, to complete his library.
I have another attention here to require my urgent attention.
Oh, Watson, it is so good to stretch oneself. You know, it's no joke taking a foot at one's height for several hours on end. Watson!
And after Watson recovers from his fainting spell, the audience is treated to a brief intermission, following which the play resumes with its second act, wherein the secret of Sherlock Holmes is at last revealed. As we once again take our seats and the play resumes, we find Holmes attempting to console Watson following his 3-year absence.
You value our friendship as little as that. Whatever your reason, I could have accommodated it. Just a word, a simple note.
My pen
Is there any secret so precious that a man can allow his closest friend to believe him to be dead for 3 whole years?
And so, with that, we are introduced to the crux of this original tale. And according to playwright Jeremy Paul, if this was to be a play about friendship, there was a mystery to solve. How could any man allow his closest friend to believe he was dead for 3 whole years? Therein lay the enigma and the key to Holmes' complex personality. If I could unravel that.
I should like to hear what happened at Reichenbach.
Oh, very well, then, you shall. About that chasm. I have no serious difficulty in getting out of it, Watson, for the very simple reason that I never was in it.
You never were in it.
But these familiar words are then followed by something slightly different than fans of Doyle might have been expecting.
Sometime after my story of your death was published, I received a letter at my room. It stated simply that Professor Moriarty was alive, that he had never met you at the Falls, was not in Switzerland at the time, and that my account, therefore, was a tissue of lies.
Did you keep this letter?
I have it somewhere in my possession.
Yeah, I think
Of course. I laid my hands on
I
it.
think it is safe to assume that it was from a Confederate, but why should they inform you?
Well, to discredit you,
But if I'm dead,
your memory then, the legend of Sherlock Holmes.
Watson explains that he arranged a meeting with the correspondent, which was to occur at Baker Street, where the good doctor had returned recently in search of some medical papers to find that the rooms had been preserved by Mycroft. At the appointed hour, Watson waited, but no Confederate of Moriarty appeared. So Watson confronted Mycroft, who denied knowledge of Holmes's whereabouts. But using Holmes' own methods, Watson became convinced that Mycroft was lying. And it is at this point that the play diverges even more significantly from the text and ventures into completely original territory.
there are certain people to whom one cannot lie. My friend is one of them. But there are certain truths which cannot be told easily. Sometimes one longs to be found out.
Holmes picks up a churchwarden from the desk and turns to face Watson before enacting a series of different poses and postures for his friend.
Watson, whom do you see in front of you?
You, of course. My friend Sherlock Holmes.
Now,
Bookseller fellow.
and now,
Idlers, loafers. Well, that's the foolish clergyman, I recognize him.
and now,
Suddenly, the music changes, and so does the mood. And it is clear that Holmes has become the archenemy of whom he has so often spoken.
it is evident that you don't know me.
On the contrary, I think it's fairly evident that I do.
It has been an intellectual treat to duel with you, Mr. Holmes. You think you can beat me? You will never beat me. And if you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much.
Holmes moves snake-like around Watson's chair, then darts upstage, where he freezes and collapses, just as Watson rushes to stop him hitting the floor. Next, Watson guides a stricken and delirious Holmes to the couch, where the duo recites some familiar dialogue from the dying detective, in which Holmes refuses treatment, stating that he has no faith in Watson's medical abilities. But he soon returns to a sober state and delivers the following, which takes us to the heart of the secret.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have no wish to alarm you. I'm afraid I am beyond the medical
For
pale.
very good reason. That you have no diagnosable symptom.
But I have devised my own remedy. It requires not your medical skills, which I'm sure are more than adequate, but your powers of deduction and logic. Will you assist me?
In any way I can.
Thank you so much. Well, you see, my illness comes from the brain. Not as cocaine, the answer I've tried to give you. The brain has the cure.
Just tell me what you want me to do.
Well, I wish to offer you the hypothesis that Professor Moriarty did not exist, that I invented him.
My dear!
You must challenge me at every point I made in your favorite claret, the fresh tobacco, and the Persian slipper you gave for
Well,
this.
of course, if you
Thank
insist.
you. Well, it was the summer of 87, I think. Yes, 87. But the idea first came to me. It may have come from one of my black fins. It probably did, I forget. But its practicality is purely logical. I am an acknowledged expert in all matters criminal. Now, if I could invent a mastermind that could draw to it like a spider over nefarious flies into its web, how much easier it would be to keep my finger on the pulse. I took my idea to my brother Mycroft of the Diogenes Club. He's entranced. He reached out his services without...
That man,
do, please.
Moriarty is known to others. I have seen his biography in publication. His education is listed, his class...
Most of the information you received, Watson, came from my own lips, and naturally you were too trusting to cross-check. But there are facts known about his remarkable career which can be verified, for the very simple reason that I put them about myself. May I continue?
By all means.
I took the name of an old mathematics professor that I had known at university. He was a sweet man. He was far removed in temperament from my creation as anyone could ever be.
Was he then the author of that book?
The Dynamics of an Asteroid, you then said.
I seem to remember you telling me that it touched such rarefied heights of pure mathematics that no member of the scientific press could possibly
For the
criticize
very
it.
simple reason that no one had ever read it. It was a poor man's life's work. It remains totally obscure and impenetrable.
Where did you base this operation?
Here! Here! In Baker Street. What? Don't you remember those odd occasions when I asked you to leave the room for an hour or so?
You were Moriarty here. All the world knows Sherlock Holmes lives here.
It was a small conceit. But Moriarty occasionally played the cuckoo when Holmes was less. It may surprise you to know that it was only necessary for me to appear in public with Moriarty twice. Once in the grill room of the Savoy Hotel, and once in the waiting room of Crew Station, I think.
Oh, no. We saw him together on the station platform at Canton.
That was my brother Mycroft.
Moriarty's brother, the colonel who wrote Defending It in the...
Mycroft again on a whim.
Reichenbach.
Don't you remember that you received a letter to the effect that the professor never was in
Oh,
Switzerland?
Mycroft wrote that.
It was almost certainly written by Colonel Moran, his
You
companion.
told me that Moriarty supplied Colonel Moran liberally with money. Now, surely, that cannot have been your own money,
No,
though.
of course not. I invented that for my own amusement.
If you invented it for your own amusement, it was at my expense. I really don't think I can believe anything you ever say again.
Well, it was only fair.
I fail to see where it is leading.
You will! I beg of you to continue!
Moriarty was seen at the Hotel at Marlow.
My third appearance, a brief one, merely for local colour.
And Colonel Moran, arriving at the Falls. If you were alone, what was he doing
That
there?
ironically was fact. I'd intimated Moran that I was to meet Sherlock Holmes for the final resolution, thinking that his master had been killed. Moran tried to avenge
The
him.
air gun. The air gun! With which Colonel Moran shot Ronald Adair. Now, you told Inspector Lestrade that Moriarty had ordered it from the German mechanic von Herten. Now, was it you? Was it you who commissioned that?
I've done things in many areas of my life which at the time I believed to be for the greater good. But we've just taken some unfortunate victim along the way. Watson, you must take me as you find me.
I find that an abhorrent answer, Holmes. I cannot accept it.
You wish me to enumerate the lives, say...
No, I cannot accept it. Anyway, there's only one question which concerns me before we abandon this fool's journey.
Help me.
If you did indeed create this monster, what prompted you to destroy him?
Ah! I could not live with him! It was either him or me! And I had considered both solutions. When the moment came, I decided to give myself one final chance.
As the play nears its conclusion, then, we are given the explanation for Holmes' absence after Reichenbach and his decision to betray the trust of his friend. And, according to Jeremy Paul, the secret of Holmes and Moriarty presented itself as something so thrilling and at the same time so obvious that I thought it must have been explored many times, if only as a hypothesis. I love this Victorian idea of doppelgangers, Jekyll and Hyde, the two sides to the human personality. I checked with a couple of Sherlockian friends who reassured me that I was on relatively new ground. The idea had once been proffered humorously by A.G. MacDonald in Punch in the 30s, but never followed up. That was good enough for me. In his book, A Study in Celluloid, Michael Cox confirmed this scholarship and expanded on it, noting, although he discovered this possibility for himself, Jeremy Paul points out, rightly so, that it is not new. It was floated by A.G. MacDonald in The New Statesman in 1929 and refuted by T.S. Blakeney in his Sherlock Holmes Fact or Fiction in 1932. Blakeney's arguments are persuasive, but not conclusive, and the theory came to the surface again in Michael Dibdin's novel The Last Sherlock Holmes Story in 1978. Dibdin's version is the most frightening of all, involving as it does not only Moriarty, but Jack the Ripper as well. Jeremy Paul's, however, is the most entertaining version because it has something perceptive to say about the complex personality of Holmes, his dependence on Watson, and his need for Moriarty. And it finds a theatrical context for this. But when all is said and done, is it a credible hypothesis? No, it is not. As Blakeney said in 1932, quoting Holmes himself. It seems to have only one drawback, and that is that it is intrinsically impossible. And as Vincent Sterrett said 10 years later, only those things the heart believes are true. But in spite of the scholarship on the topic, Paul, Brett, and Hardwick fully embraced the hypothesis and delivered a compelling drama that explored what must have seemed to many fans a grand new mystery to ponder. On Baker Street, Holmes goes on to explain that while in Tibet, he attempted to use his methods of deduction on a local crime and failed miserably. Yearning for familiar surroundings, the thronging streets of London, and his best and only friend, he longed to return. The local lama confirmed his realizations and told him to return to his Watson. But he added a shocking revelation.
Said the Holy Lama. But there is a price you must pay. The man you killed has not left you. Your friend and your enemy are one.
Now I am Moriarty.
What's it that? But his meaning was clear. You cannot have Watson without Moriarty, you cannot have Moriarty without Watson, and without both of them there is no Holmes. The three of us are inextricably bound, you see.
But Moriarty is dead. You killed him.
Yes, I killed him at Reichenbach, because he so faithfully recovered.
That is the truth.
The absolute truth. You do believe me?
I have always believed you.
Holmes breaks down emotionally and begs Watson's forgiveness, stating unequivocally that his friend was the sole reason for his return to sanity.
As to your health, I can only pray that there will be no successor to Professor Moriarty.
You've missed the point entirely. There must be a successor. For my sanity. No. I'm only comforted that he is that many-headed hydra. As soon as one head is cut off, another grows in its place. It is essential, Watson, for our well-being, that there should always be somewhere a Moriarty among us.
I doubt you'll find any decent citizens agreeing with you there.
Instead, Watson kindly suggests that perhaps, beneath the roofs of the ordinary people, they might just find a few new adventures worthy of his powers.
Will you be committing to print these secrets that we shared this evening? Verbatim.
Ah. I shall, as always, respect your wishes, Holmes. And select, tone, transpose, and omit. And I hope fulfill the expectations of your adoring public.
I'd be grateful. Thank you.
As the friends make their final reconciliations, a familiar bell rings at the door of 221B.
You can act with him.
Unless I'm mistaken, it's a client.
Upon its debut in August of 1988, the play received mixed to middling reviews. Most criticisms revolved around the fact that there was no standard mystery to be solved in the play's taut 80-minute runtime. The performances were uniformly praised, but the notices failed to drum up any legitimate critical acclaim. This, however, did not stop the crowds from flocking to the theater in droves to see Jeremy Brett and Edward Hardwick in the roles for which they had become synonymous. And after 2 weeks of sold-out shows in Guildford, the play moved to Richmond for 2 weeks before making its home in the West End at the famous Wyndham's Theatre. where it would run for a solid year, staging shows 6 days a week. And audiences weren't the only ones enjoying the play. Deputy stage manager Sally Tynan made many cherished memories on the production, as she shared with us in a recent conversation.
If the teddy bear hadn't been named after Teddy Roosevelt, it should have been named after Teddy Hardwick, because he was a teddy bear. I mean, I loved him. Mm-hmm. He was the sweetest, kindest, charming, probably should have been doing comedy. He was so funny and cuddly. He was cuddly. He was Teddy. I thought it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Acted perfectly by both. I never got bored. And believe you me, when you're calling a show 8 times a week for however many months we did, you get sick of it. And I didn't. Not at all. Not once. I mean, they directed themselves a lot of the time. Patrick was very much there with visuals, which I think is really important. But actually, the truth of the matter is, I think he knew perfectly well that it wouldn't matter what you said. Jeremy would probably choose his own path and it would be the right one, so it didn't really matter. But we got on really well, and I remember there was a scene where he wanted a silhouette, probably when Jeremy was raking through the bin to find the letter from Irena Adler. And if I say so myself, I had a banging figure in those days. I was young and very nubile. And Patrick wanted a silhouette of a beautiful woman to just waver in the background behind a gauze or a cyclorama or something like that. And he thought I would make the perfect silhouette. And it was really weird because I didn't bother me, and it was only a silhouette, it wouldn't matter. And it was Jeremy who said, no, I don't think so. And actually, in retrospect, Patrick, I think, wanted me to be naked or semi-naked. And Jeremy, I think, picked up on that and was like, no, that's not appropriate. And I got it. It would have been striking, wouldn't it, to have this beautiful figure just not fully in view. But in retrospect, he was looking at the inappropriateness of it. Anyway, Jeremy, he was out of the room more than he was in the room, smoking sometimes, and only and always Gitane. I remember that. I remember the blue packet and the little stubby, thick, unfiltered cigarettes he smoked. It was just a waft of smoke from this elegant person, and that's what he was. He even smoked elegantly, if one can do that. So, towards the end, I was leaving and therefore able to watch it. Always, that was sort of tradition. When you finally handed over, you would get to see the show. So Jeremy requested that I wear a lovely dress, which I did. I wore this bright red dress, piled my hair up, and I came to see them before the show, which is normal. Knocked on Jeremy's door and he flung it open. He went, "Darling!" And then I came and we sat and we had a glass of wine. And so as I left the dressing room to assume my position in the auditorium, I tripped up the 3 steps outside Jeremy and fell flat on my face in disarray. And all I remember is looking over my shoulder whilst prone and Jeremy slowly closing his dressing room door with a completely deadpan face and then hearing howling laughter, really loud. It abated. I had stood up by that point. He opened the door and he went, "Enjoy the show, darling." And I went, "Let's hope I make a better entrance than I made an exit." And I left. Went out into the auditorium. In the play, there is a part where Edward recounts the look of Irena, and he changed all the words to me. He said, "Do you remember Sally?" I think her name was. She walked with her blonde hair and a beautiful red dress. And I just sat in the auditorium on my own, knowing they were talking about me and looking at each person beside me thinking, oh my God. I mean, it was wonderful.
Jeremy and Edward performed to sold-out crowds from the onset, and the public reaction to the play was nothing short of adoration. But the pressure of constant performances began to take its toll on Jeremy almost immediately. Still battling the demons of bipolar disorder, Jeremy soon found himself struggling to meet the demands of the stage. But being the consummate professional that he was, Jeremy not only met his onstage commitments, but spent considerable time promoting the show on radio and television, to say nothing of the time he devoted to his adoring fans. Almost without fail, Jeremy would meet audience members at the stage door after performances to sign autographs, often even inviting them into his dressing room to spend the post-show evening socializing.
Champagne? Little red wine? Good evening, sir. Can I offer you a glass of champagne or a glass of red wine? Thank you. You're fine. Sit for a moment, please. You sit for a second. So did you enjoy it? Oh, and where do you come from? Baltimore. Baltimore? And how long are you here for? Till Sunday. You're flying on Easter Sunday? What a wonderful way to celebrate. I once celebrated Christmas. I flew to my wife in Boston on Christmas Day. And it was really beautiful. Because it was like I was flying in the right direction. And of course I've been with my children in England. But I flew towards her and we met at the airport at kind of sunset on Christmas Day. It was the most romantic meeting. We had a wonderful Christmas. We went to the Ritz-Carlton and for dinner in Boston. It was lovely. Love that. Well, that blue crystal. Isn't it wonderful as well? That room sitting up there looking out over the car. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, dear. See you on Wednesday. Good night.
A number of devoted fans who attended repeated performances even became known as the Regulars. And upon Jeremy's passing in 1995, the Regulars, along with Edward Hardwicke, had a plaque dedicated to Jeremy Brett installed in the circle bar of the Wyndham Theatre. The inscription, which hangs below a smiling photo of Jeremy, taken by Marcus Tyler, reads, Jeremy Brett, 1933 to 1995, quote, I lost a friend whom I regarded as the best and wisest man I have ever known. Signed, The Regulars. The plaque still hangs there today. But not all of the fan interactions that Jeremy encountered during his time at the Wyndham were for the best, as Edward Hardwicke recalled. Jeremy was besieged at his dressing room each evening by fans, including those he called the women in black, females who took a somewhat unhealthy interest in him, seeing him as Holmes and not as a talented actor. He told me once, I miss the protection of the Granada machine. They were able to protect me from the more outlandish fans. Not so at Wyndham's, or the various provincial theaters where the play went after its London run. As time went on, the experience of the stage play became a mixed bag for both Jeremy and Edward, with some rather extreme highs and lows, as Jeremy Paul observed. The play was an enormous strain on both actors. Ted was an absolute rock. He enjoyed the chance to get into town and to see his name in lights, which was his father's great forte. But it wasn't always easy for Ted with Jeremy, who could vary the mood of the show to some extent. Jeremy would never lose the lines, ever, but he did like to experiment with the text. But you see, that was a part of the way certain actors like Jeremy Brett and Robert Stevens see theater, that to stave off the boredom of the endless mechanical repetition of a role, they have to reinvent and re-dare. In doing so, you may miss, and on certain nights Jeremy would be the first to admit that he'd missed, but he was always thinking about the play. And I never got the sense that he was bored with it or tired of it. He kept saying, I find new things every night. In that spirit, he would change things. And Ted, the wonderful goalkeeper, gathering the back passes without temperament, would cope magnificently. I saw Jeremy's experiments as positive, and I got tremendous thrills and fizzes out of new happenings when I caught the play, but never happenings that deserted the text, which is enormously satisfying for a writer. Edward Hardwicke remembered many of these changes and later remarked, as the run had progressed, he used to play Holmes as though he was on cocaine from the moment the curtain went up. In the early days, he played Holmes superbly, and when Holmes did get high on the cocaine, he was brilliant in what he did with the moment. It was frighteningly effective, the way he conveyed this effect. But that then slowly began to invade the whole performance. I remember he used to quote a line from Twelfth Night, and as the run went on, it got longer, and finally he was doing the whole opening speech, "If music be the food of love," and all that. Duncan Weldon came in one night and said, "What the hell's going on?" Michael Cox began to take note of the dreadful strain which was being placed on Jeremy's health by the demands of 8 performances a week, stating that, quote, "Sometimes it was only Jeremy's refusal to disappoint an audience which carried him through. Actors refer to this ability to overcome their symptoms as Dr. Theater, but it is not a reliable physician." And Jeremy Paul agreed, calling it Jeremy's nightly therapy, stating, "I think it staved off an awful lot of things that would have happened if he hadn't been performing. Whatever the beginnings of things that were happening in his life during the day, he always got himself to the theater and sort of therapeutically channeled something through Holmes on the stage. Often, late at night, after the performances, he would say, 'This play is saving me.'" Brett later elaborated, telling Stephen Doyle at the Sherlock Holmes Review, "The play helped me immensely, because then I was in touch with an audience. I couldn't believe how many children came to see it, from all over the world. One little boy, Sullivan, from Dallas, 3 years old, was brought by his dad. That moved me. It helped enormously, the being in touch. Holmes is quite dangerous because you can get isolated playing him. I learned that quickly, so now I go out a lot." To NPR's Leanne Hansen, Jeremy expanded on this sentiment.
There was a time when people would say, "How do you enjoy playing Holmes?" And I would say I wouldn't cross the street to meet him. I then discovered that, of course, I meant that he wouldn't cross the street to meet me. Then when I was doing the play, which taught me a very great deal, because I was in touch with people, because filming is quite isolated, and I realized how many children were seeing him, and what a hero he was to them. I thought, oh, my, didn't know that. So I thought, my goodness, I have that joy of doing it for children. And I think I know why the children love him. And that's because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle endowed Holmes with all the sensibilities of a child up to the age of 8. Then, at the age of 8, of course, you're told not to look out of the window, get on with your Latin syntax, and they begin to diminish those extra senses. Holmes has them.
And while psychologically the play may have been helpful to Jeremy Brett, the physical demands that were being placed upon the actor became more punishing with time. During the 12-month run of the play at Wyndham's, Jeremy's heart condition worsened notably, and his prescribed medications caused him to swell with water retention. He had trouble breathing and even moving, as Edward Hardwicke recalled. Jeremy was tremendously brave, for at one time he was having such difficulty that we had to cut some of the swift exits and entrances he made during the course of the play because the strain of it was too much for him. We just brought the lights up and down instead to indicate a time lapse. He couldn't get the air into his lungs. I used to stand there and just watch the perspiration just pouring off him. I kept telling him that he must go to his doctor. He was worried that he'd have to give up the play. There were no understudies, and that would jeopardize his insurance rating. He was terrified of losing insurance coverage, which in turn would affect his television work. Elissa Swinglehurst, assistant stage manager of the show, also recalled these harrowing moments, which she witnessed from the wings.
I think one thing I would say about Jeremy is that he was one of the most courageous people I've ever known. You know, he was dealing with a lot of issues with his health, his mental health and also his physical health, but his concern was always for others. And he never moaned and he never groaned and he just got on with it. He really was courageous beyond all limits. I remember watching him on the, you could have a taxi to probably St Martin's Lane, and then it's a short walk through, so you can't actually drive to the stage door window. And he'd have to stop several times between the car and the stage door to get there. And then when he got to the stage door, literally the stage door to the number 1 dressing room, very short. It's like the length of this kitchen. It's not a long walk, and he'd have to stop between the stage door and number 1 dressing room to catch his breath. That's how ill he was. And he'd still go on stage and do a show. And I was watching him on stage, and his body was actually swaying through an arc of sort of 25 degrees. And sweat was just pouring off him. He was the colour of putty. And I went to the company manager and said, get ready, we might have to bring in the fire curtain, the fire iron, because I thought he was going to pass out. And we all just stood watching him, his body swaying backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. We made it through. But seeing him work through all that, it's just remarkable. What a brave man. What an incredibly courageous man.
Edward Hardwicke went on to say, eventually, Jeremy did see a doctor, who said instantly that he would not be responsible for him if he did another performance. He was told that he must go into hospital immediately. Jeremy wouldn't do that, but he said he'd go to a health farm instead. He did, and I think they drew off about 2 stone in liquid from him in a matter of 3 days. According to David Stewart Davies, the play closed for a fortnight while Brett recuperated, an event that fortunately was missed by the press, and on his return he was, for a time, much fitter and a little leaner. The concern and worry that Edward Hardwicke felt for Jeremy was greatly added to by Brett's increasingly difficult behavior resulting from his manic depression, as Hardwicke noted. The most difficult time I experienced with Jeremy was during the course of the play. It was a joy to begin with for the first month or 2, and then our partnership became a little strained. His performance became somewhat wayward at one point during the run. We were great friends, but to comment on his performance was a little difficult. I once said, "Jeremy, that moment used to be so wonderful, and now it doesn't seem to work." One had to approach it that way. You couldn't just say that, "You're not doing the same performance, and frankly, if Holmes really behaved like that, Watson wouldn't stay under the same roof with him a moment longer." Edward Hardwicke then digressed in an effort to clarify his comments about his friend. I must make it clear that this was not Jeremy. This was his illness acting for him. The illness is like that creature in the film Alien, always protecting itself. It will lie, behave badly, and do all sorts of unpleasant things. The moment you start thinking it's the person rather than the condition, you'll be in some difficulty handling the situation. Jeremy, who was normally such an immensely generous man, would be turned by the illness into something quite different. He could then be black and harsh. During the run, it got to a stage where we were not speaking at all. Then he suddenly rang me up one night in a fury. Absolute bile came down the phone. I knew it wasn't Jeremy, really. That creature was speaking for him. I sat up all night thinking about it. We had another 4 months to do on the play. By 6 o'clock in the morning, I had written him a 20-page letter. We had a matinee to do that day, and I went into his dressing room, gave him the letter, and said, "Jeremy, I don't want to discuss anything. I just want you to read this." He read the first page of this long, long letter, and then he smiled and said, "Oh, darling, I'm sorry." And everything was fine. But I knew there was no way we could actually discuss it. It had to be on paper. He had all sorts of misconceptions. He thought I didn't want to do the play. I didn't want to do the series. I didn't want to act with him. Looking back, I think I had been critical, but it had become very hard to play the part on stage because of what was happening off stage. Following the incredibly successful run at Wyndham's, the play toured the country, which helped Jeremy return to a much more even keel. Then, on December 16, 1989, Jeremy Brett and Edward Hardwicke took their final bows as Holmes and Watson before a live audience on the stage of the Theatre Royal in the city of Bath, Somerset, in what would prove to be the last performance of The Secret of Sherlock Holmes with its original cast. Brett and Hardwicke had fulfilled their commitments, but after 14 months of performing 8 shows a week, the actors were exhausted. According to Michael Cox, Jeremy Brett always hoped to take the play to the States and around the world, but that was not to be. Still, the play deeply touched the lives of many. Those involved in the production, from front-of-house workers to set builders and backstage personnel, remembered the show as a truly wonderful, once-in-a-lifetime experience, due largely to Edward and Jeremy's stewardship. Sunday Times best-selling ghostwriter and actor James Hogg, who got his start as a front-of-house and box office worker at Wyndham's, shared a number of fond remembrances with us in a recent chat.
There's a beautiful foyer at Wyndham's where the box office is, etc., where everybody comes in. And Jeremy insisted on buying flowers for the foyer every week. This huge arrangement of fresh flowers would arrive. And these started coming in at about 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Bearing in mind the show started at 8 or 7:30 or something like that. And he would come in, look at the flowers, and he would come into the box office is tiny at Wyndham's. You can't swing a mouse in there, let alone a cat. And he used to come in and make us tea, awful tea. Couldn't make tea to save his... It was basically just water. He would wave a tea bag at the water and smoke yellow silk cut. And occasionally, if somebody was very nice to us, because certain people, sometimes they were, occasionally he would stand up and come behind us into the window, the box office window. And if people were very, very nice, he would say, what a lovely thing to do. They might bring us up chocolates if we managed to get them seats or something like that. And he would thank them. And obviously, they had no idea he was there. And then suddenly he would appear, the person who they were coming to see. But then he goes into character. It would always be in character. He would sort of talk to them as Holmes. But the most vivid memory, there was a woman, an American with big fur coats, and she had some like half-price tickets or something like that. She had some voucher, and we couldn't take it because it was for a Saturday evening. And she took a step back and she said something along the lines of, well, you. And he went absolutely apoplectic. He came up behind us and he basically tore her a new asshole. And he spent 5 minutes, this sort of diatribe, how hard we work, how hard he's working. He doesn't do what he does. So people like you can come in here and, etc. He just destroyed her. It was fucking amazing. It really was. Obviously, her attitude changed immediately and she was just full of apologies and compliments for him and compliments for us. And it actually, it turned out okay. Partly sort of thanks to her because she did a lot of grovelling. But yeah, he was right from the start, bought everybody presents at Christmas, cleaner, and everything was addressed to that person. Every single person who worked in that theatre, regardless of how many hours a week, received a present and a card at Christmas. It was unlike anything. I mean, I stayed on for several years, worked in theatre, front of house, became assistant manager, etc., worked at the Donmar Warehouse and the Piccadilly. There was nothing like this ever again. I seem to remember the curtain calls were amazing. So Ted would come out, the lights would go down, applause, then, the lights would go back up. There'd be this gap of about 30 seconds. Jeremy would appear, but he would sort of appear by grabbing hold of a curtain and basically edging himself around. And then he would see the audience. Then he would sort of go in shock. God, there's the audience there. As if it was so fucking theatrical. It really, really was. Sort of like, then he'd, oh no, I'm going to come and see who are you? And then he would start these hugely theatrical bows. Then he would sort of concentrate on Ted. He would take Ted to the front of the stage, quite rightly, and make sure that Ted was getting his just applause. And then he would go for it again. And he would but the last night was bonkers. It went on for about 10 minutes. Obviously, because Triumph Productions, the producers, Duncan Weldon, etc., made a fortune from it. They really have. They made an absolute fortune. So they were standing throwing flowers. It was just absolutely fantastic. I wish somebody had recorded the show. I'll tell you what we'd never seen as well. The amount of people at the stage door after the show. There must have been 500 people waiting outside for Jeremy. It was always for Jeremy, and Ted sort of snuck away. But again, never seen anything like it. It was a massive success, and if it could have carried on, I'd have done it for the next 10 years. I think everybody would have, apart from Ted. Yeah, everyone else would. It was astonishing.
The play has since gone on to enjoy a number of revivals. First, at the Royal Theatre in Northampton, starring Edmund Kent and John Harwood in 1998, and numerous times since then, including a recent staging at the Duchess Theatre in London, starring well-known actors Peter Egan and Robert Dawes. We recently spoke to Mr. Dawes about his experience playing Dr. Watson and his recollections of his good friend, writer Jeremy Paul.
So I'd known Jeremy, and he was the most lovely, lovely man. And when Patricia and Jeremy decided to move from their beautiful family home in Richmond, they moved down to Swanage. So I saw an awful lot more of them. Slightly more of Jeremy because he liked to pint along the seafront in a very nice pub we used to visit. And he was always working on new projects and books. And he loved cricket, for instance.
Right.
He wrote a wonderful cricket book, and he'd play cricket wherever he could. So yes, I got to know Jeremy very well over the years. And the last time I saw him, in fact, was when he came to see the play its last week at the Duchess Theatre. And the last thing I ever saw him, because he died shortly after, very sadly, was him waving goodbye as he strolled away from the theatre and turned right into the Strand with his usual extraordinary gentlemanly flair. So yes, I've got a lot to thank Jeremy Paul for.
Let's talk about the play for a moment. I mean, the choices made in The Secret, well, as you know, Jeremy Brett, at least in the Granada series, he was a real stickler for canonical fidelity, shall we say, sticking to the original stories. But the play, there's some real divergences there, especially in the second act, obviously.
Yes.
But it's written in such a way that, shall we say, maybe is open to interpretation. So what is your interpretation of The Secret?
My interpretation, and I suppose I have an insight because I can remember, obviously, this was a question that came up when we were working on the play with Jeremy.
Right.
He would love to have heard what you just said, that it's open for interpretation, because that's what he hoped. He hoped people would take away from the end their own idea of, was it true or was it not? Was it a fiction, something that was just part of his madness and a fantasy? So a very bold premise, really, in many respects for Jeremy to take. When it was on tour, he said, some people would say, was that real, or was he making that up? Was this just frenzied rambling and misremembering of,
right,
or did it actually happen? And that's just the way Jeremy wanted it. Yeah. And I presume that's the way Jeremy Brett wanted it. But the play is pure Jeremy Paul in that respect. And I think it's a fascinating turn of events. What can you believe?
Yeah.
His whole life was actually finding out deception, investigating people who were constantly trying to get away, putting up facades and fantasies to protect their crimes. And at the end of the day, Sherlock Holmes has been doing exactly the same as the people that he has trailed and detected and caught. I think that's a fascinating conclusion to the play. And as you rightly say, it in Jeremy's hands as the author and playwright, Watson doesn't really allow him to get away with it. He puts up a pretty good fight. Yeah. He's very, very angry. He feels betrayed. And so, I think it's a fascinating conceit and one that I think Jeremy executed very well.
Yeah.
I don't know what people who had never heard of Sherlock Holmes thought of it if they ended up in that theatre. I've no idea.
I wondered if there was like a certain depiction that maybe rubbed off on you for your Watson, or if you just approached it completely individually.
I sort of had an idea. I mean, by that time I'd seen your Nigel Bruce's and I'd seen your Teddy Hardwicks, and the way it was written was this man coming back from the Afghan wars, and he's been through hell. He's tough and mentally strong and lacks self-pity. But at the same time, he has this extraordinary patience and charm, almost saint-like patience and charm, with this extraordinary man who, as a doctor, and therefore to some degree with his scientific side and logical side of his brain, he realizes what an extraordinary and special man Sherlock Holmes is. Yeah. To some degree, you get the feeling that over their relationship, as much as Watson loved Sherlock Holmes, he was also at the same time studying this extraordinary specimen of humankind. Mm. And within the play, there was one moment where Watson talks about the loss of his wife.
Right.
And in the play, there was such vulnerability in Watson and such despair at this loss because, he loved his wife dearly. I mean, how she saw any time at all, I don't know, considering all the adventures and time he would spend with Sherlock Holmes. But, her loss was a great, deeply upsetting to him. And that was my way in, I think. I thought anyone who can feel this is not just a bluff, jolly sidekick. So there's a real human being here, and you have to be kind, which are qualities that I think Conan Doyle imbued the character of Dr. John Watson, definitely.
In the final paragraph of Jeremy Paul's introduction to the published playbook, he wrote, "So, would Holmes have approved of The Secret of Sherlock Holmes? Or would his creator? Well, maybe Watson should have the last word on that. Quote, I shall, as always, respect your wishes, Holmes, and select and hone and transpose and omit, and hopefully fulfill the expectations of your adoring public." For Jeremy Brett, when all was said and done, he reflected back on his experiences with Holmes in the theater versus Holmes for the screen. To blogger Gunner54, he recalled, "The thing about working on the stage that makes it harder is that film is so instantly near, it can see right into the person's soul. With someone so unbelievably isolated and closed as Holmes is, it's sometimes easier to get the internal workings of the private man across on camera. He's such a private creature, and with the camera, you can slide in and see the flicker of things across his face. You can see little things that sometimes at the back of the theater you can't see. Little disappointments, little angers, little changes of mind. Of course, the other things you can get across on camera are his brilliant deductions and observations, but also his amazing intuition. And that's easier to do on film." And to film, Jeremy would soon return. The theater had kept Jeremy and Edward from television for more than 2 years. And while much had changed behind the scenes at Granada during the play's run, a brand new series was on the horizon, and the time had finally come to open the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. Please join us for part 2 of our examination of The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, which is available now. We hope to see you there.